Dr. Sarah Chin had always been known for her stubborn streak, but even she hadn't expected it to cost her everything she'd worked for in a single night. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital emergency room buzzed overhead as she stood in the break room, staring at the termination letter in her hands. 24 hours earlier, she had been the most respected emergency physician on the night shift. Now, she was persona non grata, banned from the very place where she had saved countless lives. The trouble had started 3 weeks ago, when the first patient arrived. Mrs. Rodriguez, a 67-year-old grandmother, had come in complaining of severe chest pain and shortness of breath. Standard protocol dictated a series of tests, but something about her symptoms didn't match the typical heart attack presentation. Sarah had seen thousands of cardiac cases, and this felt different. The woman's skin had an unusual pallor, almost grayish, and her pupils were slightly dilated despite the bright emergency room lights. Dr. Richard Morrison, the chief of emergency medicine, had been clear in his instructions. Run the standard cardiac workup, Chin. EKG, troponins, chest X-ray. We don't have time for your hunches tonight. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something crucial. She had requested additional blood work, specifically testing for unusual toxins and rare infectious agents. Morrison had denied the request, citing budget constraints and the need to move patients through the system efficiently. That was Sarah's first act of defiance, though she hadn't seen it that way at the time. She had quietly ordered the additional tests anyway, using her own authorization codes and planning to cover the costs herself if necessary. When the results came back 2 days later, they revealed traces of an unknown pathogen in Mrs. Rodriguez's bloodstream. By then, however, the woman had been discharged with a diagnosis of acid reflux and anxiety. The second incident had occurred just 5 days after Mrs. Rodriguez's discharge. A construction worker named Tommy Phillips had arrived with similar symptoms, but his case was complicated by what appeared to be severe food poisoning. The attending physician, Dr. Jessica Walsh, had been ready to treat him for gastroenteritis and send him home with anti-nausea medication. Sarah had insisted on running the same expanded blood panel she had ordered for Mrs. Rodriguez. Chen, you're overstepping your bounds, Dr. Morrison had warned her during their heated discussion in his office. These patients don't present with anything unusual. You're wasting hospital resources on unnecessary tests. I'm putting you on notice. But Sarah had persisted. Something was connecting these cases, something that went beyond standard emergency medicine protocols. The blood work on Tommy Phillips had revealed the same mysterious pathogen, along with elevated levels of a compound that shouldn't exist in the human body. She had immediately contacted the Centers for Disease Control, only to be told that without more cases and concrete evidence, they couldn't justify an investigation. The third patient, Maria Santos, a college student, had arrived on a Thursday evening shift. She presented with neurological symptoms that her friends attributed to excessive studying and energy drink consumption. Tremors, confusion, and intermittent loss of consciousness had brought her to the emergency room. Dr. Morrison had been off duty, leaving Dr. Walsh in charge. When Sarah suggested the expanded blood panel, Dr. Walsh had initially agreed, thinking it might reveal drug use or alcohol poisoning. The results had been terrifying. Not only did Maria Santos have the same unknown pathogen, but the levels were significantly higher than in the previous patients. More alarming was the presence of what appeared to be engineered proteins, structures that couldn't occur naturally in any known biological system. Sarah had immediately isolated the patient and contacted both the CDC and the FBI's bioterrorism unit. Dr. Chin, you've officially lost your mind, Dr. Morrison had said when he arrived at the hospital after being called in. You've created a panic over what's probably lab contamination. These patients have nothing in common except your obsession with finding conspiracies where none exist. But Sarah had done her research. Mrs. Rodriguez worked as a custodian at the federal building downtown. Tommy Phillips had been part of the construction crew renovating the same building's ventilation system. Maria Santos was an intern at a law firm located on the 3rd floor of that very building. The connection was undeniable, yet her colleagues remained skeptical. The breaking point had come when a fourth patient arrived. Dr. James Wright, a CDC epidemiologist who had been investigating Sarah's reports, stumbled into the emergency room with the same symptoms, but in an advanced stage. His condition was critical, and Sarah knew that standard treatment protocols wouldn't save him. She needed to try an experimental treatment she had researched, a combination of antiviral medications and chelation therapy to remove the foreign proteins from his bloodstream. Dr. Morrison had explicitly forbidden any experimental treatments. "We follow established protocols, Chin. I don't care if the patient is CDC. We're not going to risk a malpractice suit because you want to play scientist." That's when Sarah had made the decision that would change everything. She had waited until the night shift skeleton crew was busy with other patients, then administered the experimental treatment to Dr. Wright. Within hours, his condition had begun to improve dramatically. The foreign proteins in his blood started breaking down, and his neurological symptoms subsided. For the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah felt vindicated. Her triumph was short-lived. Dr. Morrison had discovered what she had done during his morning rounds and had immediately called hospital security. "Dr. Chin, you are hereby suspended pending a full investigation. You've endangered a patient's life with unauthorized treatment and violated every protocol we have. Clear out your locker." The suspension had quickly escalated to termination when the hospital's legal team became involved. Despite Dr. Wright's recovery, which he attributed entirely to Sarah's intervention, the administration couldn't overlook her repeated violations of direct orders. The medical board was notified, and Sarah faced the very real possibility of losing her license to practice medicine. As she packed her personal belongings from the emergency room, her colleagues watched with a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. Dr. Walsh approached her cautiously. "Sarah, I want you to know that I believe you were onto something. The way Dr. Wright responded to your treatment, it wasn't coincidence." "Thanks, Jess," Sarah replied, fighting back tears of frustration and exhaustion. "But believing me and supporting me are two different things. I understand why you couldn't stick your neck out." Dr. Wright, now fully recovered and back on his feet, had tried to intervene on her behalf. He had written a detailed report to his superiors at the CDC, documenting not only his own case but Sarah's discoveries about the potential bioterrorism threat. However, the hospital administration remained unmoved. They had their protocols, their liability concerns, and their reputation to protect. Sarah's last act before leaving the hospital was to compile all her research and evidence into a comprehensive report. She documented every test result, every patient interaction, and every instance where standard protocols had failed to address what she believed was a coordinated biological attack. She sent copies to the CDC, the FBI, the Department of Health, and anyone else she thought might listen. The silence that followed was deafening. No one called. No one acknowledged her reports. It was as if her months of investigation and the 4 patients she had connected simply didn't matter. The federal building remained open, its employees continuing to work in what Sarah was convinced was a contaminated environment. The construction on the ventilation system was completed without any environmental testing. Sarah spent her days in her small apartment, poring over medical journals and research papers, trying to understand what she had encountered. The pathogen didn't match any known biological agent, and the engineered proteins suggested a level of sophistication that was deeply troubling. She began to wonder if she was dealing with something beyond conventional bioterrorism, something that required resources and knowledge that few organizations possessed. Her savings were rapidly depleting, and without a medical license, her career options were severely limited. She had reached out to former colleagues at other hospitals, but word of her termination had spread quickly through the medical community. No one wanted to hire a doctor who had been fired for insubordination, regardless of her previous stellar reputation. The isolation was perhaps the hardest part. Sarah had devoted her life to medicine, to helping people, and now she found herself cut off from the very profession that defined her identity. She questioned whether she had made the right choices, whether her defiance had been justified or simply the product of an overactive imagination and professional arrogance. But late at night, when she couldn't sleep, Sarah would review the blood work results and patient files she had managed to copy before her termination. The evidence was there, undeniable and terrifying. Something was happening in that federal building, something that was making people sick with a pathogen that didn't exist in nature. Someone had created this, someone with access to advanced biotechnology and the means to deploy it in a populated building. As she sat in her darkened apartment on what she didn't know would be her last night of obscurity, Sarah made a decision. If the established authorities wouldn't listen to her, she would find someone who would. She began researching investigative journalists, environmental activists, and anyone else who might be willing to help her expose what she believed was a clear and present danger to public health. What she didn't know was that her reports hadn't been ignored. They had been classified, buried in the labyrinthine bureaucracy of national security agencies. Her evidence was too compelling to dismiss, but too sensitive to handle through normal channels. Somewhere in a secure facility outside Washington, D.C., analysts were beginning to piece together a picture that would shock even seasoned intelligence professionals. The phone call that would change everything was still hours away, but the wheels of a much larger investigation were already in motion. Sarah Chen's stubborn refusal to follow orders had uncovered something far more dangerous than a simple biological attack. She had stumbled onto the edges of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, a plot that threatened not just the people in one federal building, but potentially the entire national security infrastructure of the United States. The shrill ring of Sarah's landline phone cut through the silence of her apartment at exactly 5:47 a.m. She had been awake for hours, hunched over her laptop, cross-referencing symptoms and pathogen characteristics with obscure research papers she had found in international medical databases. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, and her eyes burned from staring at the screen, but sleep had become impossible since her termination. "Dr. Chen?" The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and completely unfamiliar. "This is Colonel Michael Harrison from the U.S. Army Medical Research Command. I need you to listen very carefully and not hang up." Sarah's first instinct was indeed to hang up. She had received her share of prank calls and angry voicemails from colleagues who blamed her for embarrassing the medical profession. But something in the caller's tone made her pause. There was an urgency there, a gravity that felt genuine. "How did you get this number?" she asked cautiously. "Dr. Chen, we've been reviewing your reports regarding the incidents at St. Mary's Hospital and the federal building contamination. I'm calling because we need your expertise immediately. There's been a development." Sarah felt her heart rate quicken. "What kind of development?" "The kind that requires security clearance to discuss over an unsecured line. Can you be at the Pentagon in 3 hours?" The Pentagon. Sarah had never imagined those words would be directed at her, especially not after her professional disgrace. "Colonel, I'm not sure what you think I can offer. I've been terminated from my position, and I'm facing potential license suspension." "Dr. Chen." Colonel Harrison's voice became even more serious. 12 people are dead." The words hit her like a physical blow. She sank into her chair, her mind racing. "Where? When?" "I can't discuss details over the phone, but I can tell you that the pathogen you identified has surfaced in a federal facility in Colorado. We lost contact with the entire research team 18 hours ago. When our hazmat teams entered the facility this morning, they found 12 bodies and evidence of the same engineered proteins you documented." Sarah's hands began to shake. She had known her discoveries were serious, but the reality of actual deaths made everything terrifyingly concrete. "What do you need from me?" "Everything you know, and everything you can figure out. A car will pick you up in 90 minutes. Pack for an extended stay, and bring any research materials you have. Dr. Chen, I need to be clear about something. What you uncovered isn't just a public health threat. We believe it's connected to a potential national security breach of unprecedented scope." After hanging up, Sarah moved through her apartment like someone in a dream. She packed quickly, grabbing clothes, her laptop, and the thick folder of copied medical records and test results she had compiled. As she waited for the car, she tried to process what was happening. 3 weeks ago, she had been a respected emergency physician. Now she was apparently being recruited by the Pentagon to investigate what sounded like biological warfare. The black SUV that arrived was unmarked but obviously government issue. The driver, a stern-faced woman in military uniform, said nothing during the 2-hour drive to Washington. Sarah spent the time reviewing her notes, trying to prepare for whatever awaited her at the Pentagon. She kept thinking about the 12 people who had died, wondering if her earlier warnings could have prevented their deaths. The Pentagon was even more imposing in person than she had imagined. The driver led her through a series of security checkpoints, each more thorough than the last. Sarah's credentials were checked and cross-checked, her belongings were scanned, and she was required to surrender her cell phone and any electronic devices. Finally, she found herself in a windowless conference room deep within the building, facing a group of individuals who looked like they hadn't slept in days. Colonel Harrison was younger than she had expected, probably in his early 40s, with graying temples and intense blue eyes. He was accompanied by Dr. Rebecca Martinez from the CDC, Agent David Park from the FBI's Bioterrorism Unit, and a woman who was introduced only as Ms. Thompson from the agency. The atmosphere in the room was tense, charged with the kind of urgency that comes when lives are at stake. Dr. Chin, thank you for coming, Colonel Harrison began. Before we start, I need you to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Everything we discuss in this room is classified at the highest levels. Sarah signed without hesitation. Whatever was happening, it was clearly bigger than her personal and professional troubles. Dr. Martinez opened a laptop and turned it toward Sarah. We need you to look at these images and tell us what you see. The photographs were horrific. Bodies in what appeared to be a laboratory setting, some collapsed over workbenches, others sprawled on the floor. But what caught Sarah's attention immediately was the condition of the victims. Their skin had the same grayish pallor she had observed in her emergency room patients, but more advanced. Some showed signs of rapid cellular breakdown that she had never seen in any pathological condition. The facility in Colorado was supposed to be conducting routine atmospheric research, Agent Park explained. It's operated by a private contractor with high-level government clearances. They were studying air filtration systems for government buildings. Sarah looked up sharply. Air filtration systems? Like the work being done at the federal building where my patients worked. Exactly like that work. Ms. Thompson spoke for the first time. Her voice was cold, analytical. We believe someone has been using these renovation and research projects as cover for deploying biological agents in federal facilities. The implications hit Sarah like a wave. You're saying this is deliberate? Someone is intentionally infecting government workers. Colonel Harrison nodded grimly. That's our working theory. The pathogen you identified appears to be engineered specifically to target individuals with certain genetic markers common in government employees who have undergone security background checks. That's impossible, Sarah protested. You can't create a pathogen that targets people based on their employment history. Dr. Martinez pulled up another screen showing genetic analysis data. Actually, it's more sophisticated than that. Government employees who receive high-level security clearances undergo comprehensive medical examinations. Those records, if accessed by the wrong people, could provide detailed genetic profiles for target selection. Sarah studied the data, her medical training helping her understand the complex genetic markers being displayed. This is incredibly advanced bioengineering. We're talking about resources and expertise that would be available to only a handful of organizations worldwide. Which brings us to why you're here, Ms. Thompson said. Your treatment of the CDC epidemiologist was successful because you understood intuitively that this wasn't a natural pathogen. Traditional antiviral and antibacterial treatments are ineffective because the organism is artificial. It's designed to be resistant to conventional medicine. But my experimental treatment worked because I approached it like a toxin rather than an infection. Sarah realized. I use chelation therapy to bind and remove the foreign proteins. Exactly. And that insight may be the key to saving lives if this spreads beyond isolated facilities. Agent Park opened a thick folder. We've identified at least 15 federal buildings where similar renovation work has been conducted over the past 6 months. All by the same network of contractors, all involving ventilation and air filtration systems. If our suspicions are correct, we could be looking at a coordinated attack on the federal government infrastructure. The scope of what they were describing was staggering. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the responsibility being placed on her shoulders. What exactly do you need me to do? Colonel Harrison leaned forward. We're assembling a joint task force to investigate and neutralize this threat. You would lead the medical response team, working to develop treatment protocols and preventive measures. But I have to warn you, this assignment comes with significant personal risk. What kind of risk? Ms. Thompson answered. If our analysis is correct, whoever is behind this has access to highly classified information about government personnel and facilities. They've demonstrated the capability and willingness to kill federal employees. By joining this investigation, you would become a target yourself. Sarah thought about the 4 patients she had treated, about Dr. Wright's recovery, about the 12 people who had died in Colorado. The choice seemed obvious. When do we start? The next several hours were a whirlwind of briefings, security protocols, and medical consultations. Sarah learned that the mysterious pathogen had been designated Agent X by military researchers, though its exact composition remained unknown. The Colorado facility had been studying samples of the organism when the outbreak occurred, suggesting that even trained biological researchers in contained environments were vulnerable to its effects. More disturbing was the discovery that the Colorado team had been close to identifying the pathogen's origin before their deaths. Their research computers had been wiped clean, but fragments of data recovered by cyberforensics experts suggested they had traced the organism to a biotechnology laboratory with connections to several foreign governments. The lab in question was supposedly shut down 3 years ago after violations of international biosafety protocols, Dr. Martinez explained. But intelligence suggests it may have continued operating under different ownership and with more sophisticated security. Sarah reviewed the fragmentary data, her medical training helping her piece together the incomplete picture. If this pathogen was developed in a foreign lab, how did it end up being deployed in American federal buildings? That would require an extensive network of operatives and years of planning. Which is why we believe this goes beyond simple bioterrorism. Agent Park said. This has the hallmarks of a state-sponsored operation designed to cripple American government functionality. The briefing continued into the evening, with Sarah learning about the complex web of contractors, subcontractors, and shell companies that had been involved in the building renovation projects. Financial records showed payments flowing through multiple international accounts, making it nearly impossible to trace the ultimate source of funding. The operation had been planned with meticulous attention to detail and sophisticated understanding of American government procedures. As the day wore on, Sarah began to understand why her stubborn refusal to follow standard medical protocols had been so important. The pathogen had been designed specifically to evade detection by routine medical testing. Only her insistence on expanded blood work and her willingness to think outside conventional medical frameworks had revealed its presence. Had she simply followed Dr. Morrison's orders, the first cases would have been misdiagnosed, and the victims would have died without anyone understanding what had killed them. Dr. Chin, Colonel Harrison said as the briefing concluded, I want you to understand that accepting this assignment means your old life is effectively over. You'll be working under deep cover classification for the foreseeable future. Your family and friends will be told that you're participating in a long-term research project abroad. No contact with previous colleagues or unauthorized individuals. Sarah thought about her empty apartment, her ruined career, and the isolation she had felt since her termination. In many ways, her old life was already over. At least this new path offered a chance to use her skills for something that truly mattered. I accept, she said without hesitation. Ms. Thompson handed her a new identification card and a thick packet of documents. Welcome to Operation Clean Air, Dr. Chin. Your new life begins now. 3 months into Operation Clean Air, Dr. Sarah Chin had become someone she barely recognized. Gone was the confident emergency room physician who had openly challenged her superiors. In her place stood a covert operative with multiple identities, advanced weapons training, and access to classified medical research that pushed the boundaries of modern science. The transformation had been necessary, but it came at a cost she was only beginning to understand. The task force headquarters was located in a repurposed subway station beneath downtown Washington, accessible only through a network of maintenance tunnels that had been classified since the Cold War. The facility buzzed with activity around the clock, staffed by specialists from every branch of government and several allied nations. Sarah's medical laboratory occupied an entire platform, equipped with containment systems and research equipment that surpassed anything she had ever seen in civilian hospitals. Working alongside her was Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a brilliant virologist who had been recruited from a pharmaceutical company after her entire research team had been killed in what was officially reported as a laboratory accident. Like Sarah, Dr. Tanaka had initially resisted the idea that the deaths were anything other than tragic mistakes. Unlike Sarah, she had discovered the truth only after surviving an assassination attempt that left her hospitalized for 3 weeks. The blood samples from the Denver incident are showing the same protein modifications we found in Colorado, Dr. Tanaka reported as she emerged from the biosafety containment chamber. But there's something new. The pathogen appears to be evolving, adapting to our treatment protocols. Sarah looked up from her microscope, where she had been studying tissue samples from the latest victims. Denver had been their 4th confirmed attack site, a federal courthouse where 6 employees had become ill during what appeared to be routine maintenance on the building's heating system. This time, however, their experimental treatment had been less effective, managing to save only 3 of the 6 victims. Evolution or adaptation? Sarah asked. Because if someone is actively modifying the pathogen based on our responses, that suggests real-time intelligence about our operations. Dr. Tanaka's expression was grim. I've been thinking the same thing. The modifications are too precise, too targeted to be random mutation. Someone knows what we're doing. This possibility had kept Sarah awake for weeks. Operation Clean Air was supposed to be operating under the deepest possible security classification, with information compartmentalized so thoroughly that most team members knew only their specific roles. Yet the enemy seemed to anticipate their moves with disturbing accuracy. Colonel Harrison appeared at the laboratory entrance, his usual composed demeanor showing cracks of strain. The past month had aged him visibly as the scope of the threat became clear. Dr. Chin, we need to talk. Agent Thompson's office, 5 minutes. Sarah followed him through the maze of corridors that connected the various operational centers. The underground facility had grown dramatically since her arrival, with new sections being excavated and equipped as the investigation expanded. What had initially appeared to be a focused bioterrorism threat had revealed itself as something far more complex and dangerous. Agent Thompson's office occupied what had once been a station master's quarters, its walls now lined with monitors displaying intelligence feeds from around the world. Thompson herself stood before a large screen showing a map of the United States, with red markers indicating confirmed attack sites and yellow markers showing locations where suspicious activities had been reported. We have a problem, Thompson began without preamble. Intelligence intercepts suggest that our next target will be significantly larger than previous attacks. Instead of isolated federal buildings, we believe they're planning to target a major government complex. Sarah studied the map, noting the concentration of markers around Washington, D.C. The Pentagon? Possibly, but we think it's more likely to be the Capitol complex. Congressional hearings are scheduled next week on cybersecurity threats, with testimony from high-ranking intelligence officials. It would be an ideal target for maximum political impact. The implications were staggering. A successful attack on the Capitol during active congressional sessions could effectively decapitate the American legislative branch. Sarah felt a chill as she realized how sophisticated their opponents had become. Do we have any intelligence on timing or method? Colonel Harrison pulled up additional screens showing architectural diagrams and ventilation systems. Based on the pattern of previous attacks, we believe they'll use the ongoing renovation work in the Capitol's basement levels. Construction crews have been working on upgrading the building's environmental systems for the past 6 weeks. Have you verified the backgrounds of everyone involved in that construction? Sarah asked. Thompson's smile was humorless. That's where things get interesting. The primary contractor is a company called Atmospheric Solutions International. On paper, it's a legitimate business with an excellent safety record and proper security clearances. In reality, it appears to be a front operation that was established specifically for this purpose. Dr. Tanaka, who had joined them during the briefing, raised an obvious question. If we know it's a front operation, why haven't we shut it down? Because we're using it to trace the larger network, Thompson explained. Atmospheric Solutions has connections to at least 12 other companies across 6 different countries. If we move too quickly against the immediate threat, we lose our chance to identify and neutralize the entire operation. Sarah understood the logic, but she also knew what was at stake. How long do we have? Based on the construction schedule and the pattern of previous attacks, we estimate 72 hours before the pathogen is released into the capital's air system. 72 hours to prevent what could be the most devastating domestic attack in American history. Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility that had driven her to defy orders in the first place. But now the stakes were infinitely higher, and the consequences of failure were unthinkable. What's our plan? She asked. Colonel Harrison activated another screen showing detailed floor plans. We're going to insert a covert team into the Capitol construction site. Your job will be to locate and neutralize any biological agents before they can be dispersed. Dr. Tanaka will remain here to coordinate medical response if we're unsuccessful. And if the pathogen has already been deployed? Then, we evacuate the building and implement emergency medical protocols for potentially thousands of victims. The briefing continued for another hour, covering every aspect of the planned operation. Sarah would be going in disguise as a safety inspector, accompanied by 2 Special Forces operatives posing as her assistants. They would have access to portable detection equipment and experimental neutralizing agents that had been developed based on her successful treatment of Dr. Wright. As the meeting concluded, Thompson handed Sarah a secure communication device. Dr. Chen, I need to brief you on something that hasn't been shared with the rest of the team. We believe we've identified the source of the intelligence leaks. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Someone on our team? Someone with access to our operational details. The modifications to the pathogen that Dr. Tanaka identified couldn't have been developed without detailed knowledge of our treatment protocols. We're dealing with a mole who has been feeding information to our enemies since the operation began. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had come to trust and rely on her new colleagues, particularly Dr. Tanaka and Colonel Harrison. The thought that one of them might be betraying the mission was almost too painful to accept. Do you have a suspect? Thompson's expression was carefully neutral. We have suspicions, but no proof. Which is why I'm telling you this privately. We believe the mole will try to sabotage the capital operation. You need to be prepared for the possibility that your backup may not be reliable. Sarah left the meeting feeling more isolated than she had since her termination from St. Mary's Hospital. The underground facility that had become her new world suddenly felt foreign and dangerous. She found herself scrutinizing her colleagues with new suspicion, wondering which of them might be working for the enemy. Back in her laboratory, she began preparing for the mission with methodical precision. She reviewed the chemical composition of their neutralizing agents, double-checked the calibration of her detection equipment, and studied the architectural plans until she could navigate the Capitol's basement levels blindfolded. But her mind kept returning to Thompson's warning about the mole. Dr. Tanaka approached her workstation as she was packing her field equipment. Sarah, I wanted to talk to you about something. I've been reviewing the intelligence reports, and I think there's something we're missing about the pathogen development. Sarah looked up, studying her colleague's face for any sign of deception. Dr. Tanaka appeared genuinely concerned, but Thompson's warning had made her paranoid about trusting anyone. What kind of thing? The level of sophistication we're seeing isn't consistent with a foreign laboratory operating in isolation. The genetic modifications, the targeting systems, the resistance to our treatments. It suggests access to American research data and ongoing intelligence about our responses. You're saying someone on the American side is actively collaborating? Dr. Tanaka nodded reluctantly. I hate to think it, but the evidence is pointing toward involvement by someone with high-level access to our biological defense research. Maybe someone who knows our capabilities well enough to develop countermeasures. The conversation was interrupted by an alarm that echoed through the facility's corridors. Emergency lights began flashing as loudspeakers announced a security alert. Sarah and Dr. Tanaka exchanged worried glances before hurrying toward the command center. They arrived to find chaos. Multiple screens showed surveillance footage of armed figures moving through the facility's access tunnels. Colonel Harrison was coordinating defensive positions while Thompson worked frantically at her communication console. How did they find us? Dr. Tanaka asked. Thompson looked up with a grim expression. They didn't find us. They were led here. The implication was clear. The mole within their operation had finally made their move, providing the enemy with detailed information about the facility's location and security measures. Sarah realized that their carefully planned mission to stop the Capitol attack had been compromised before it even began. As security teams prepared to defend the facility, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. She grabbed her field equipment and headed for one of the emergency escape routes that led directly to the surface. If their underground operation had been compromised, she would have to complete the mission alone. Behind her, she could hear Dr. Tanaka calling her name, but Sarah didn't turn back. Too many lives were at stake to let organizational security concerns stop her from acting. She had defied orders before when lives were on the line, and she was prepared to do it again. As she emerged from the subway tunnel into the chaos of downtown Washington, Sarah realized that she was once again completely on her own, facing an enemy that seemed to anticipate her every move. But this time, she wasn't just fighting for a few patients in an emergency room. The entire American government was depending on her ability to stop a biological attack that could reshape the balance of world power. Sarah Chin crouched in the darkness beneath the Capitol building, her heart pounding as she listened to footsteps echoing through the construction tunnels above her. She had been moving through the underground maze for 3 hours, using maintenance blueprints memorized during her mission briefings to navigate toward the building's main ventilation system. Her portable detection equipment showed dangerous levels of the engineered pathogen in the air around her, confirming her worst fears. The biological agents had already been deployed. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was once again defying orders and working alone against a biological threat. But this time, the stakes were measured not in individual lives but in the survival of American democracy itself. Above her, congressional hearings were scheduled to begin in 6 hours, with senators and representatives gathering to discuss national security threats. None of them knew that they were walking into a biological trap that could kill hundreds and cripple the government for generations. Her secure communication device had been silent since she left the compromised underground facility. Sarah didn't know if Colonel Harrison and the others had survived the attack, or if Dr. Tanaka had managed to complete her research on the pathogen's latest mutations. She was operating completely on her own, with only her medical expertise and the experimental neutralizing agents she had developed to stand between the country and disaster. The construction area was eerily quiet, which set off alarm bells in her mind. Based on the work schedules she had reviewed, there should have been crews working around the clock to complete the ventilation upgrades before the hearings began. The absence of any activity suggested that the final phase of the attack was already underway. Sarah activated her night vision equipment and began moving more carefully through the tunnel system. Her detection instruments showed that the pathogen concentration was highest near the main air circulation pumps, exactly where she had expected to find the deployment mechanism. But as she approached the target area, she began to hear voices speaking in low, urgent tones. She pressed herself against the tunnel wall and listened carefully. 2 men were discussing technical details about air flow rates and dispersal patterns. Sarah recognized enough of the terminology to understand that they were fine-tuning the biological attack to ensure maximum coverage throughout the Capitol complex. What chilled her most was that both men spoke with American accents and demonstrated detailed knowledge of the building's security protocols. Moving closer, she was able to observe the operation through a ventilation grate. The main air circulation chamber had been converted into a sophisticated biological laboratory, with containment systems and dispersal equipment that looked far more advanced than anything she had seen during her months with the task force. Banks of computer monitors showed real-time data about air flow patterns, pathogen concentrations, and projected infection rates. At the center of the operation stood a figure that Sarah recognized with shock, Dr. Robert Morrison, her former chief of emergency medicine from St. Mary's Hospital. He was dressed in a hazmat suit and appeared to be supervising the final preparations for a massive release of the engineered pathogen into the capital's air system. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. Morrison had been the one who fired her, who had dismissed her concerns about the first patients, who had prevented her from investigating the biological threat when it might have been stopped. Now she understood why. He had been part of the conspiracy from the beginning, using his position to ensure that the pathogen's early deployments went undetected. But Morrison wasn't alone. As Sarah watched in growing horror, she saw other familiar faces among the conspirators. Dr. Jessica Walsh, her former colleague from the emergency room, was operating sophisticated detection equipment. Agent David Park from the FBI's bioterrorism unit was coordinating with what appeared to be foreign operatives. Even more shocking was the presence of Dr. Rebecca Martinez from the CDC, who had been part of Sarah's briefings and had access to all of the task force's research data. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. These weren't foreign terrorists or isolated extremists. They were highly placed American officials and medical professionals who had been systematically undermining their own government's security for reasons that Sarah couldn't begin to understand. She activated her portable recording equipment and began documenting everything she observed. Whatever happened to her, this evidence needed to survive so that the full extent of the conspiracy could be exposed. As she recorded, she overheard crucial details about the attack timeline and the sophisticated countermeasures that had been developed to neutralize any intervention attempts. The pathogen release is scheduled for exactly 30 minutes before the hearings begin, Dr. Morrison was saying. By the time symptoms start appearing, the entire leadership will have been exposed. The treatment protocols developed by Chen's team will be useless because we've modified the organism to resist their neutralizing agents. Dr. Walsh looked up from her monitoring station. What about Chen herself? Intelligence reports suggest she escaped from the underground facility. Chen is no longer a threat, Agent Park replied with chilling confidence. Even if she reaches this location, she'll be walking into a controlled environment where we have every advantage. Her neutralizing agents won't work against the current pathogen variant, and she has no backup support. Sarah felt a surge of determination mixed with fear. They were right about her isolation, but they had underestimated her ability to adapt and improvise. She had been developing contingency plans throughout her mission, preparing for exactly this kind of scenario where her standard protocols might fail. Moving carefully through the ventilation system, she positioned herself above the main laboratory area and began preparing her own countermeasure. Instead of trying to neutralize the pathogen directly, she would target the dispersal system itself. Her field equipment included a prototype electromagnetic pulse device that could disable electronic systems within a limited radius. If she could time the pulse correctly, she might be able to shut down the entire operation. But first, she needed to understand exactly how the dispersal system worked and identify its critical vulnerabilities. Sarah spent precious minutes studying the equipment layout and airflow patterns, looking for the optimal point to deploy her countermeasure. What she discovered was even more alarming than she had imagined. The biological attack wasn't limited to the Capitol building. The conspirators had installed similar systems in federal buildings throughout Washington, D.C., all synchronized to activate simultaneously. The attack on Congress was just the beginning of a coordinated assault designed to paralyze the entire federal government. As Sarah processed this information, she heard Dr. Morrison giving orders to begin the final countdown. Initiate dispersal sequence in T-15 minutes. All personnel to containment positions. 15 minutes to prevent a catastrophe that would fundamentally alter American society. Sarah knew she had only one chance to stop the attack, and failure would mean not just her own death but the collapse of the government she had sworn to protect. She activated her electromagnetic pulse device and dropped it through the ventilation grate into the laboratory below. The explosion of light and electromagnetic energy immediately disabled most of the electronic systems, plunging the area into darkness and chaos. Emergency sirens began wailing as backup power systems struggled to restore functionality. But Sarah's sabotage had only bought her a few minutes. The conspirators had planned for electronic warfare tactics and had manual backup systems for their most critical equipment. She could hear Dr. Morrison shouting orders for immediate deployment of the biological agents using the emergency protocols. Sarah dropped through the ventilation grate into the laboratory, landing hard on the concrete floor. She immediately activated her personal protection systems and began deploying her experimental neutralizing agents into the air circulation system. The chemicals she had developed wouldn't stop the pathogen entirely, but they might reduce its effectiveness enough to save some lives. Dr. Sarah Chin. Dr. Morrison's voice came from across the darkened laboratory. I have to admit, I'm impressed by your persistence. But you're too late to stop what's already begun. Emergency lighting flickered on, revealing that the conspirators had managed to activate their manual dispersal systems. Sarah could see biological agents beginning to flow through the air circulation pipes toward the Capitol's main chambers. In minutes, senators and representatives would be breathing air contaminated with an engineered pathogen designed to kill them. Why? Sarah called out as she continued working to deploy countermeasures. Why would American citizens attack their own government? Dr. Morrison stepped into the light, his hazmat suit making him look like an alien figure. Because sometimes the system becomes so corrupt that it needs to be completely rebuilt. The current government has failed its people, failed its principles, and failed its responsibilities to the world. What we're doing today will create the opportunity for a fresh start. By murdering hundreds of innocent people? By removing obstacles to necessary change. Dr. Walsh interjected as she appeared from behind a bank of equipment. The people who will die today have been systematically destroying this country through their corruption and incompetence. We're performing surgery to remove a cancer. Sarah realized that she was dealing with fanatics who genuinely believed they were saving the country by destroying its leadership. Their conviction made them even more dangerous because they were willing to sacrifice everything, including their own lives, to achieve their goals. As the biological agents continued flowing toward the Capitol chambers, Sarah made a desperate decision. She couldn't stop the attack entirely, but she might be able to redirect it. Using her knowledge of the building's ventilation system, she began manually adjusting airflow controls to divert the contaminated air away from the occupied areas and toward the building's exterior exhaust systems. The conspirators realized what she was doing and moved to stop her, but Sarah had positioned herself at the central control point where she could manipulate multiple systems simultaneously. A fierce struggle ensued as she fought to maintain control of the airflow while her opponents tried to override her actions. During the fight, Sarah managed to activate an emergency evacuation alarm that began broadcasting throughout the Capitol building. Even if she couldn't completely neutralize the biological attack, she could warn potential victims to evacuate before the pathogen reached lethal concentrations. The battle for control of the ventilation system continued for crucial minutes as Sarah used every technique she had learned during her covert training. When Dr. Morrison finally managed to override her controls, she estimated that she had successfully diverted approximately 60% of the biological agents away from the occupied areas. As security forces began responding to the evacuation alarm, Sarah realized that her mission was essentially complete. She had prevented the catastrophic loss of life that the conspirators had planned, though she couldn't eliminate the threat entirely. The evidence she had recorded would expose the conspiracy and allow authorities to neutralize the broader network of collaborators. Dr. Morrison raised a weapon toward her as the sound of approaching sirens filled the underground chamber. You've delayed us, Chun, but you haven't stopped us. There are backup plans, other operations, more locations than you can possibly imagine. Sarah met his gaze steadily. Then we'll stop those too. That's what we do when lives are at stake. We never give up, no matter what orders we have to defy. The last thing she remembered before losing consciousness was the sound of federal agents storming the laboratory, and the satisfaction of knowing that her stubborn refusal to follow orders had once again saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to those who valued ideology over human decency.